In this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete podcast growth and marketing strategy for 2025, how to grow and market a podcast based on two things. The first one is a very brand new report that has been analyzing more than 500 podcasters for more than a year and what have been the factors of growth of those podcasts. There is a complete report here, and the 1,249 podcasts that I have personally analyzed since the creation of our marketing agency that focuses on podcasts 2.5 years ago. I'm giving you the whole playbook in this video. There is literally everything based from data, science, what we've seen emerging as main trends, and then our experience. I'm giving you the whole playbook here. This is everything that we are going to cover, from how to grow discoverability, content, SEO, how to actually get people to click, how to structure an episode, what is the best length for an episode, what do the best in class do, the show notes game, how to do a proper call to action, how to market a podcast according to science, like what has been the most important changes over the last few years, what works the best for different categories of podcasters, and our input on each of those aspects, how to properly repurpose the content, our secret weapon that I'm gonna talk through in the end of this video, and much more. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. How to grow and market a podcast. So what I want to start with is a small statement of where the podcast market is today. So growing a podcast in 2025 definitely isn't the same thing as growing a podcast in 2020, which was already not the same thing as growing a podcast in 2015. 2015, the format was not even yet that popular. 2020 has really seen a huge amount of podcasters starting their podcast because of the lockdown. And in 2025, the numbers are at the highest, both in terms of audience, but also in terms of podcasters. So how to make sure that you stand out from the crowd, stand out from the noise, and how to actually grow a successful podcast. I'm going to walk you through everything. There is, so this study, Podcast Marketing Academy, which has done a fantastic job at following more than 500 podcasts for more than a year. I'm going to put the link towards this study in the YouTube description of this video. So let's get on with the show. In 2025, it is easier than ever to start, produce, and maintain a podcast. And that couldn't be closer from the truth. Nowadays, you have like just plenty of tools, platforms that help you start, produce, and maintain the podcast. Like it's very, very easy. The barrier to entry is very low, which means a lot of people like try the adventure, are just starting their own podcast, which means you also have a lot of podcasters starting a podcast, which leads us to have a growth that is harder than ever. Actually, growing a podcast is very, very difficult. But what does that mean in terms of numbers? Because this is what I want this video to be around as well: numbers, facts, and data. So here is a little graph of the number of podcast listeners over the year. So it is a like 2-digit % growing market each and every year. So it's a very, very promising market wherever you are in the industry. If you are in podcasts, you have chosen the right industry. And so 2024, the data are not closed yet. That's projected numbers, obviously. But so if you look from 2019 to 2023, we have 69.10% more listeners in 2023 than 2019, which is not double, but not too far from being a doubled audience. So it's a very fast growing industry and a fast growing media. On the other hand, we can also look at the number of new podcasts created from 2019 to 2023. So again, all the studies, all the graphs, everything will be in the description. You can check this information. Those are all from very reliable sources. So this one is from Statista 2024. This one is from Demand Sage, but which is also taking information from Statista. So it's rock solid. And if we look at what happened in terms of new podcasts created, we see that before 2016, nothing was really happening. Already in 2016, we more than doubled the number of new podcasts compared to 2014. So this is how many new podcasts are being created every year. This is not the total number of podcasts that there are each and every year, just the ones created. But we clearly see an upward trend towards 2020, with 2020 exploding with more than 1 million new podcasts created. This is fading a bit down since, which is obviously normal, going back to normal numbers. This is also because winners take all. I'm going to get back to this in a little while. But so as we see, the potential audience that you can tap into if you start a podcast has been growing over the years, but so are the number of podcasters. So whilst everything is getting easier to create and to maintain, there is also much more people in the place, which is why it is harder than ever to grow a podcast, because although not all of these podcasts are still active or have even published more than 3 episodes, but still the trend is more listeners, but also much more podcasters. So because more podcasters are competing for a less faster growing overall audience, what does that actually mean? So in that study from Podcast Marketing Academy, they show the downloads per episode distribution depending on where you are in the food chain. So we see that 70% of podcasts are actually getting more than 1,000 downloads per episode. And we're going to cross-reference it with other data and sources. We're going to see that it's even worse than this. And actually, there is only the top 10% podcasts that are actually getting a big audience of more than 10,000 downloads per episode. And you have like something happening between top 10 and top 30% podcasts where people are getting between 1,000 and 10,000 downloads. Here again, those are numbers based on the 500 plus podcasts that have been followed for this specific study. But what is actually happening when we look at a platform like Buzzsprout? So Buzzsprout is the second biggest podcast hosting platform. And each and every month on buzzsprout.com/stats, that you can go and check out, it will be in the description, they give an overview of all the data from the podcasts that are being hosted on their platform. It's completely anonymized, but it gives you a good understanding of like how many people download podcasts, listen to podcasts, in which country, on which device, and so on and so forth. And we see, so this is not an all-time number of episode downloads, but this also gives a good indication of how many downloads can you expect in the first 7 days of a publication. And usually what we will look when it comes to podcasts is first 7 days, first 30 days, and lifetime. But first 30 days is usually a good indicator of how popular your podcast is. But the good thing is, of course, is that if you have evergreen content, people can listen to your podcast years and years after. So if we look at the top percentiles of podcasts, we see that the top 1% of podcasts gets within the first 7 days, on average, 4,709 downloads. So we see that we are already much lower than the numbers given in Podcast Marketing Academy's study. Top 5% podcasts can expect about 1,000 plus downloads in the first 7 days. Top 10% less than 500. And then if you are below the top 25%, you are getting 100 downloads or less per episode. So this is much more of a reality check on how difficult it is to get a performing podcast. Now, we're going to talk about this. Big audience doesn't mean profitable audience, and it's not always the objective of a podcast. You can target a very narrow niche and be very renowned and successful in that niche. But it's just to show that winners take all. Like a very small percent of podcasts are actually getting the largest amount of downloads by far. And as you can see, there are like a bunch of other data on this website that you can use. So if we look a little bit more into this data, what does it actually mean? Well, it means that the top 5% podcasts are actually getting more than 90% of the total number of downloads. This is only for Buzzsprout, so the only disclaimer here is obviously there is one bigger podcast hosting platform, which is Spotify for Podcaster, which detains, I think, more than 40% of the market share. So it will be interesting to also see the stats from there, but obviously they are not communicating on it. But point being, this gives us a good understanding of what and where the trend is at. Now, with all that being said and with context being put back in place, how to actually grow a podcast? And by that, I want to narrow the problem even more down, which is how to get a podcast that grows by itself. Because, of course, we're going to talk about ways to market your podcast or your future podcast if you're thinking of starting one. But the best thing you can ever do for your podcast is to have it grow on itself, meaning having so good content that people are resharing and are following and are coming back more than you have people not listening again. So it actually compounds and grows on itself. This is a good indicator of when you should actually start marketing a podcast. So in this section, we're going to cover a lot of things. We're going to cover consistency, seasonality, consumption rate, meaning retention rate, choosing your niche, what content type and format you should go for if you want to grow in podcast, how to actually getting discovered, the episode structure and length that we recommend, and what is happening in the market. Show notes 101. So I want to show you how we are doing show notes at GHA Marketing. Again, like leaving no stone unturned. I'm giving you the whole playbook here and how to implement proper call to actions to grow the podcast. So I want to start with according to data. There are three things I want to cover here. And I'm saying according to data because then there's going to be the according to Guillaume Jouvencel from GHA Marketing. So according to data, consistency is key. There is such a thing as podcast seasonality and what retention rate you should go for if you want your podcast to grow. More about each of the sections right now. So consistency is key. So if we look at this specific chart, which might be a bit hard to understand, but what we want to look at is the section on the left. So the size of the podcast. So we see that the ones getting more than 10,000 downloads per episode, right? We see here in the little legend are in purple, between 1,000 and 10,000 are in pink, and less than 1,000 are in white. And here there is something that is clearly standing out is that a podcast getting more than 10,000 downloads per episode is on average being produced and active for almost 8 years. What does that actually mean? It means that podcast is a long-term game. Now, of course, and as we walk through our clients, there's lots of things that you can do to make a successful podcast before even having a big audience. But when it comes to reaching these kind of numbers, so more than 10,000 downloads per episode, and according to this specific study, this takes on average 8 years, or at least the podcasts that we're getting this specific metric are around for 7.9 years. And that clearly puts in perspective like what it actually takes to get a successful podcast. So those podcasts have been started even before COVID and are now that successful. If you are aiming at between 1,000 and 10,000 downloads, then you should have the podcast for at least 4.5 years and 2.9 for less than 1,000 downloads. Now, small words on the growth rate. Here, it's actually the other way around. So like we see podcasts with an exponential growth in the first 2.7 years of their existence, then 3.3 years for between 18 and 100% growth, 3.4 years for 0 to 18% growth. And actually some of the podcasts were having a negative growth after 4.3 years. But so here again, it shows that, yes, you will grow fast in percentage in the first few years, but in absolute, you're actually going to reach a very good size only after a while. There are ways to work around this. It's not an absolute truth, but it's super important to bear in mind. So this is assuming, by the way, one episode per week, and you can have a successful podcast story with one episode every other week, and then there is all the rest. So here, it's a little bit of my input on that. We see podcasts really growing, really building momentum when they release at least one episode per week. In our opinion, an episode per week is a minimum. You can get away with one episode every other week if your show is very qualitative, if you have a big audience or a big niche, if you're inviting big time guests on the show. But one episode a week is really what's required to get a good compounding momentum to grow a podcast. That is for consistency. Consistency is absolutely key to grow a podcast. Now, if you are thinking of starting a podcast or focusing some marketing efforts around your podcast, you might find interesting that there is such a thing as podcast seasonality. And here, this is just something broken down by the study again, showing the number of downloads per episode by month. So we see actually that July and September really stand out, and December as well. And then we go down to sub 450 downloads per episode. We see that the beginning of the year is on the lower end of the number of downloads. I just found this stat interesting. Obviously, it's not because like in May and June on average, there are less downloads that your podcast, and you should aim at having less downloads on those specific periods. But it's interesting to see that, for instance, August is really dead compared to July and September. And there are some things that you might want to take into account when it comes to big ad spend, for instance, to market your podcast. If you are thinking about doing it in Q2, think about doing it as of the beginning of Q3. Yeah, and this is the number of published episodes per month on average, according to the podcast in this study. So here we see that there are very little number of podcasts that are releasing less than one episode every other week. It's like on average 3.7 per month. Just found the data interesting as well. Now, a quick word on retention rate. So we see that the podcasts getting more than 10,000 downloads are actually having the highest retention rate. Surprise, surprise. More about this in a second. But so between 1,000 and 10,000 downloads per episode, the retention rate on average is 72%, and less than 1,000%, the retention rate is less than 66%. So I'm going to get back to this in a few minutes, but something I want to mention here. Like a few years ago, like before 2020, actually, the average podcast consumption rate was very close to 100%. People starting listening to a podcast were usually going till the end. Now, obviously, the audience is much more diverse. There are much more people, which means less people going till the end of the episodes, and also much more podcasts, right? So you're tempted to go and listen to another show or even another episode, in which case some of your episodes might be cannibalizing each other. But the whole point being, the podcasts that are getting the most downloads have the highest retention rate. There is a whole section about how to structure your episode to achieve this later in this video, but the whole point here is retention rate should be taken very, very seriously. Not only will it be important if you want to rank in the charts, because Apple Podcasts and Spotify look at this specific metric to be like, okay, on an average of 100 people listening, starting this episode, how many arrive at the end? And this is going to determine the quality of your show, and this is going to help you or not rank in the charts. But also overall, you want people to consume the entirety of your content, right? You can't fight the few people that will never listen to a whole episode, but you want to optimize for everybody that might, because this is going to play such important role in the growth of your podcast, but also in the number of people who come back, right? Somebody finishing your episode means that they got value from the beginning till the end, so they will probably want to come back. If you have some specific call to actions at the end, which we recommend, you get people to listen to it if they finish the episode, and so on and so forth. So episode structure, more about this later in this video. So this was according to data. Now let's look at the number one factor of a growing podcast according to Guillaume and GHA Marketing. So this is based obviously on the experience we have with our clients. And I couldn't start this section without talking about the content. So here I'm going to cover three things. First of all, riches are in the niches. I'm also going to talk about actually publishing content that people want to listen to. You're going to understand a little bit later on what I mean. And then quality. I think you get a good understanding of what this section is going to be about, but that's what I want to cover. So first of all, riches are in the niches, and I thought interesting of starting this section with a little meme from our very loved Drake. So what we've seen many times at GHA Marketing when onboarding a client or when talking to podcasters is, okay, what's the mission of your podcast? And so many people answer, something around the lines of, hey, I want to share life lessons, and I want to talk about leadership and success, and my podcast is about having great conversations. Anybody listening to this will get value from it. And this, especially in 2025, couldn't be a worse approach to podcasting. I'm not saying that some podcasts aren't going to be extremely successful with this approach. And actually, when you look at the biggest podcasts out there, most of them are around those lines. But that's the whole point. There are so many podcasts competing for exactly this. What you want to be doing in 2025 is to actually niche down, actually look at a very narrow niche, own that niche, and then potentially expand that niche once you have a followers base that is already built. Niche content means at the end, in the long run, a bigger audience, and a narrow niche of hardcore fans is always going to be better in any case than a broad passive audience. And the comparison I make with the podcast about life lessons, leadership, success, and great conversation is a podcast about the history of wealth. You couldn't do more niche, and that's actually the topic of one of our clients' podcasts. So actually, when we look at some of our most successful clients, and here I'm just taking those examples to show that riches are in the niches. We have a Service Business Mastery, who is owning that niche and who actually has a top 5 ranking in the Apple Podcast charts in the marketing category in the United States. So like this is the most competitive category to rank in. And they were at some point top 5, and now they vary between top 15 and top 10, which is still huge. But the whole point is those two guys, Josh and Tersh, are talking about home service businesses, how to help HVAC, plumbing, roofing, electrician, companies and business owners to grow their business. This is what they talk about. They are not talking about leadership success or like business success. They talk about how to run a successful success if you're an HVAC, they started with this, or a plumbing or an electrician or a roofing company. That's it. And they are owning that niche, and now they have one of the biggest podcasts in marketing because they have niched down so much. Jonathan Williams from Welsh History Podcast, same thing. He's getting dozens of thousands of downloads each and every month thanks to such a niche. Because what you might be thinking is like, oh, but why is he not talking about history? Then there is so much broader audience. Like if somebody listens to his podcast, they are only interested in the Welsh history, the Wales history. And that's the whole point. Like what Jonathan has done is he's passionate about his topic, obviously. But what he has done without knowing it is that now anybody wanting to listen or to consume content about the history of Wales in an audio format is going to find his podcast, because it's literally the only podcast talking about the history of Wales. It's super, super niche. You might think, oh, but it's such a small part of the world. But actually, you have lots and lots of history there. You have lots of people interested into visiting Wales. And that's who listen to the podcast. And he has a very largely successful show. Same thing for Paul Barnhurst. Again, just to give another example of a successful podcast, this guy talks about financial modeling and FP&A, so financial planning analysis. If you don't know what it is, it's not too bad, do not worry. But it's basically a niche of a niche in finance for a certain size and type of companies. This is super niche, and he is owning that niche. He has almost 100,000 followers on LinkedIn now, and he had made podcasts very successful, his podcast very successful. All I'm saying here is you want to niche down. This is what's going to get you a successful podcast in 2025. You need to choose a niche and own that niche. Now, according to the study, we can see some growth rate depending on the topic. So obviously at the top, we find business and health and fitness. Education is right after. What we might want to focus on is more than 100% growth. Now, remember, more than 100% growth doesn't mean that you have a very successful podcast. It's just that if you had 20 downloads last year and you have 40 now, you have 100% growth. But it's still a good indicator of what type of niche does very, very well. Again, you should be doing a podcast about what you feel like doing. Just narrow it down within that niche. But if you want an indicator of what topic is growing faster than others, you can have a look at this. A small word on the format of the podcast. So obviously, if you have a podcast, you can have interviews, you can do solo episodes, you can co-host an episode with or without guests. It can be narrated, like National Public Radio, for instance. It can be a roundtable, fiction, and so on and so forth. The number one fastest growing podcast is by far the interview format. And this just makes so much sense, because actually you are networking with somebody, you are inviting somebody on the show, you are hopefully getting them to spend a good time on the show. And what you want them to be doing is to reshare this episode, share it to their audience. So it's just such a simple hack to associate your image with, for instance, authorities in a niche, but also to tap into their audience. So this is for the riches are in the niches part, and I also want to talk about what to do then. Okay, you've chosen your niche, and now what? What content should you be releasing? And I call this section actually publishing content that people want to listen to. And by that, I mean, absolutely no offense, but I've been talking to a lot of podcasters, and it's like, oh, but I don't want to talk about this, or that's not something I'm very well versed into, or like, that's not the theme of the podcast. And I'm like, fine, you can totally choose to do a podcast for you, right? And you can record the episodes that you're interested in, that you want to talk about, that you think are relevant and important. But then if you're doing that, you're not necessarily optimizing for growth, right? If you want to optimize for growth, what you should be doing is actually look at what is it that people want to listen to, want to learn about, want to consume content on. So when we work on a specific podcast, for instance, we're going to start the whole thing with an in-depth research of like, who is it that we're targeting and what is it that those people are actually looking for. So you can use tools like Google Trends, Google Keywords Planner, or social networks. Obviously, social media is a huge source of information. Quora, Reddit, like you have tons of places on the internet where you can see for a specific community, for a specific theme, what is it that people are actually typing? What is it that people are actually looking for? You can see growth or decrease month on month on those specific terms, on those specific things. And that's what you want to position yourself on. You want to position yourself on the top trending question/topic in Google Trends, in Google Keyword Planner, because this is actually something that people want to listen to. And then you can build an episode around this, right? And of course, you're going to give your personal input, your experience, and so on. But you should be, if you want to grow in podcasts, talking about what people want to talk about. So you increase your chances of getting discovered and found by people, but most importantly, listened to. You should also be looking at what our competitors doing, right? And not only to say, hey, see what their content works well and try to replicate. Of course, that's a tactic. You can definitely draw inspiration from your competitors. But it's also interesting to see other podcasts, what YouTube channels are talking about, see what videos are successful, how they position themselves, and how you can potentially position yourself differently to actually differentiate and be a unique actor in the space. Like Jonathan Williams with the Welsh History podcast. He's not talking about history or the history of the world or the history of England. He's talking specifically about the history of Wales, and this is how he has positioned himself. So competitor analysis is a very interesting thing to do, especially when it comes to podcasting and YouTube channels. And on top of that, you can see what works and what doesn't. Now, once you have all those bits and pieces of information, what you want to be doing and driving your episode structure around, or at least how to approach the theme of an episode, is a few folds. So the first one is you want to have episodes around pain points, especially if you have a tactical podcast, right? If you have a podcast because you're a business owner, what you want to be doing is, okay, negativity is always going to be more successful in drawing and catching attention in people than positivity. That has been proven many, many times by mainstream media and so on. It's super, super important. And when you hit on specific pain points, people are like, oh, he's actually talking about the thing that I'm struggling with. And it's a much higher likelihood of people clicking on your episode. So talking about pain points and how to, of course, resolve that pain is a very good way to get a great podcast. You can have tactical ways to solve their problem episodes, how-tos, for instance, which is going to guide people on how to solve those specific problems. Case studies are very, very good and very, very important because at the end of the day, why should somebody listen to you? Why should somebody go and find out more about your company, your services, whatsoever? Well, if you showcase case studies of people who look like them, who've been through the same thing, who smell like them, who whatever like them, they can relate, they can identify themselves to your guest, to your case studies, and they will be like, okay, this person is literally talking about how they solve the problem for somebody exactly like me. So case study is very, very important. And the last thing that I've put here is authorities. You want to interview authorities in your niche. This might not happen overnight, right? Especially when you have a podcast that is just starting. But as soon as you start getting some reviews, some social proof, some audience, it's very good to reach out to high authorities in your niche and to get them on your show. Not only will you associate your image with them, and so people will say, okay, if this person has interviewed the top 10 speakers in the industry, they might have something to say as well, right? They might have learned a lot, or at least they know the right people. And this is something you want to create in a podcast space, which is like, oh, okay, this podcaster knows his craft because he actually talked to so-and-so, which shows that those people are taking him seriously, and it's kind of a virtuous circle. And again, you are tapping into those authorities audience, which usually is rather broad. Now, when it comes to how to structure your podcast, how to structure your episodes, so this advice is going to be more for people who want to start a podcast to support their growth, to support their company or their services. The way we like to approach it is actually a quote from Alex Hormozy, which says, "Give away the secrets, sell the implementation." As you can see, this is exactly what I'm doing with this YouTube video. I'm literally giving you everything that I know about how to make a podcast successful. And I think that's a good way to approach podcasts in 2025, meaning there is so much information out there. There are so many people trying to sell stuff, trying to talk about stuff, people who are often unqualified, by the way. What you want to be doing is actually give away the secret. Say, hey, this is how you make this work. Because in any case, 99% of people will have something else to do, will be too busy, will not take it seriously, will whatever, right? So actually putting out the secret of how to do something successfully thanks to a podcast is not a big deal, but it will build you an audience. It will build authority and trust in the market. And then if you have something to sell, it's a much easier sale. But so whether you have something to sell or not, that's something that we like a lot. Give away the secret. Have a podcast as qualitative as possible. Say how it works. Give away everything and potentially call to action for other things. And I'm saying this because if you want content that grows in itself, you actually need to be putting out great content. Basically, what you want to be happening is you want the episode to be shared. You want people to come back. So you want recurring listeners. You want to get high consumption rates. More about that in a few minutes. Basically, every listener should be and should result in more listeners. For every 10 people that listen to you, at least ideally 10 of them come back, but at least on top of that, one or two new listeners should come from like, hey, I've listened to this episode from so-and-so. It's absolutely fantastic. By the way, this one might be interesting for you. Boom. That's what you want to be happening. Every listener should bring at least another listener or part of a new listener. This is how you get a podcast that grows on itself. And again, this is before you market it, right? Because you can market it as much as you want. If you market something that when people go to, they won't come back, you will get more and bigger numbers for a certain period of time, the time that you market it. But as soon as you're going to stop that, you're not going to get this growth anymore, and you're going to have a decreasing podcast. By the way, a very good way to come up with ideas for content on top of pain points, tactical ways to solve problems, case studies, and authorities is getting feedback from your audience. So if you already have a certain audience size, or if you already have people that you're in touch with in the community, not in the podcast, obviously, it can be very, very good to listen to their feedback and create content around it. If you talked to, 100 clients in the last whatever days, what are their main questions? What are their main concerns? What are the things that they want help on? And craft episodes around this. The biggest question I had in my calls with potential clients and clients is, how do I grow my podcast? And this is how I came up with the idea of this video. So listening to your audience feedback is very, very important. Now, one last thing about content. Quality, quality, quality. So as you've seen a little bit higher in this video, right? So many people are starting podcasts right now. You have a lot of things out there. Not all the podcasts are actually of very high quality, and this is our chance to stand out, right? And in any case, if you want people to come back, if you want people to share, if you want people to consume a lot of your content, it needs to be of as high quality as possible. So obviously putting out the right content is number one priority into this. But then what? Obviously in podcasts, you have the audio. I also want to talk about video and very quickly content again. But so when it comes to audio, and that's a myth that I want to debunk here. You don't need the best setup. You don't need an absolutely amazing microphone that costs you $600 to get. No, you need a half-decent microphone. You need the audio to be good to listen to. And honestly, if you have earphones from Apple, for instance, or of any minimum good quality brand, this is going to be good enough. Like, you don't need the highest quality possible to start. Plus, you have tons of tools nowadays that help you get a good audio. So good microphone is important, but let's just say good enough microphone is important. Then using a good platform where you have separate audio tracks recording is important. So we recommend Riverside, but you also have StreamYard, Zencaster, tons of things out there. You can then edit your audio properly yourself using CapCut or the tools from Photoshop. And then you can edit, right? So you have CapCut, you have the Adobe tool, you have Descript as well. So Descript, very good platform to do everything very easily on laptop without having a lot of knowledge about audio editing. But again, as said, it's very easy nowadays to produce a podcast, and those tools are really helping that. Now, you might be asking, okay, but what about my guests, right? It's a bit hard to get a good audio when my guest has a, let's say it, crappy microphone. And do not worry, I got you covered here. So I said there are amazing tools out there nowadays, one of them being the Adobe Audio Enhancer. So you have tools out there using AI where you can just upload an audio file, and then you need to toggle and like choose a percentage of enhancement, but that gets an audio to like podcast studio production level quality, even if you have a very crappy audio. Adobe Audio Enhancer, go and check it out. It's something that has just changed our life. Now, again, you need to do this for each audio file. You need to choose the right percentage in order not to have too much of a mechanic/robot voice for one of the speakers. So it takes a little bit of craft, but that allows you to get a very good audio quality right from the get-go. There you go, giving away the secrets. And then you have music, intro, outro. So here again, needless to say that you need to have good audios in there. You need to have proper transitions, right? This is how you're going to incrementally make the experience of the listener better, which increases your chances of them resharing, coming back, and so on and so forth. I also want to talk about video quality in this episode. So I'm going to quickly cover some stats about YouTube. So YouTube since 2023, so according to a survey, here again, I'm going to put all the links in the description, but according to a survey, beginning of 2023, they asked US listeners which platform they preferred for listening to podcasts. And already then, YouTube came out top at 33%, Spotify 24%, and Apple Podcasts 12%. Another study, so this is not a survey anymore, but a study, Q3 of 2023, said exactly the same thing. And actually, depending on the source, so YouTube is on top, but the difference is even more important. Like almost twice the size, bigger than Spotify and Apple Podcasts together for the study of Cumulus Media and Signal Hills Insights. Like YouTube cannot be overlooked anymore if you want to take the podcast game seriously. And producing a good enough video for your podcast episode is very easy nowadays. So YouTube, biggest podcast platform out there, period. So that's something you do not want to overlook. And by the way, not a lot of people know this because it is not reflected in the podcast distribution platforms. If you're hosted on Spotify for Podcaster, Megaphone, Spreaker, Red Circle, Buzzsprout, Casters, Libsyn, whatever, right? There are plenty of tools out there. They do not show the number of downloads on YouTube. And this is for a simple reason. YouTube is not allowing the link between those different platforms. If you want to publish your podcast on YouTube, you just need to connect the RSS feed to your YouTube account and it will treat them as videos and upload them on YouTube Music. But so no podcast distribution platform will reflect the actual number on YouTube, but they are huge. They are huge. We cannot overlook it. And of course, your episode will be performing better if you have video on YouTube. Same for Spotify, right? So there is an article on the Spotify website. Here again, I'm gonna put the link in the description that talks about the rise of video content on Spotify. And it's actually overwhelming how many people consume video podcasts on Spotify. Like it's big. I'm not gonna go through all the numbers in here, but it's like growing extremely fast and it's extremely highly consumed and it's extremely successful. So if you want your podcast to be successful on Spotify, you might want to consider video as well. It's a whole different effort, but it can be very worthwhile if you want to grow your podcast. Now, there is one question that emerges from here, which is, should I record my podcast episodes in an actual studio, like in something professional, or will a Zoom-like type of recording do? So like I'm saying Zoom here, but like Riverside, StreamYard, Google Meets, Teams, whatever, right? A tool that just allows you to have an interview remotely and have that type of video. So here it's mainly come down to what's the objective with the podcast, right? Obviously, if you want to represent a very qualitative brand, if you want to grow a top 0.01% podcast, you might want to consider recording in a studio. Now, for 99.9% of the podcasters, especially the ones starting, you do not need the best video possible. A Zoom-like will do just fine. Just the important thing is just to remember, who are we doing this for? We are doing this for an audience, right? What is it that makes a video more compelling to watch? Obviously, if you have the nice decor and the nice microphones and the nice stuff and so on, this is going to be slightly better. But the incremental efforts to get there compared to the returns are very low. Versus what you want to be doing is having somebody being able to see your face, having somebody being able to empathize with you, to relate to you. And the video is going to allow that, which is why it's super, super important when you're consuming a 1, 2, 3 hours conversation to sometimes be able to see the person's face, because this is what's going to create that specific connection with your audience and from your audience to the podcaster. And this is how you're going to get people to come back, to relate to you, to engage with you, and to become hardcore fans. So obviously, I cannot say that video in a podcast studio is better, but for 99.9% of us, a Zoom like, as long as you have good enough lighting, right, like I have right now, as long as you have a half decent mic, and this is how you get a top quality podcast. And of course, there is the last component, which is content, but that we already covered very broadly in the previous section. Now, you now have very good content, but how to get it discovered? How to get people to actually find your content so they can eventually click on it? This is what we're going to cover right now. So I want to cover organic, paid discoverability, and also how to get clicks, which is going to come at the end of this section. But so organic discoverability. So here, obviously, we have to talk about SEO. So SEO on the, so SEO stands for search engine optimization, right? And it's how to get people to find your stuff when they are looking for specific pieces of content. So here we're going to cover on podcast platforms, obviously YouTube, but also websites. So the way we need to see podcast platforms SEO is very, very simple, very, very straightforward. If you've done SEO for a while now, and you very much know what I'm going to say, but it basically comes down to keyword stuffing. The podcast platforms are not yet as optimized as a Google algorithm, right? So the methods that work for Google, not saying that they are not working for the podcast platforms, but the podcast platforms are very, very simple when it comes to SEO. You need to stuff as many keywords as possible in there, in the show title, in the show description, in the show notes. Now, what do I mean with keyword stuffing? It's basically having the keyword that you want to position yourself on being repeated as many times as possible. This is it. Like if you talk about fitness, you want to put in fitness as much as possible. If you talk about cars, you want to put in the word car as much as possible in your podcast. If you're talking about paddle for 70 plus years olds in South Africa during the summer period, you need to have the specific keywords in your podcast. That is it. So what does that mean in practice? So I'm just going to walk you through the example of Podcast Gurus, which is one of our own shows, which is optimized for SEO. So here, as you can see, we have the podcast artwork, which is just Podcast Gurus powered by GHA Marketing, which is going to be what most people see, right? The podcast artwork. And then the title of this podcast is Podcast Guru, interviews on podcasting, podcast growth, podcast marketing, content strategy, and SEO. Because those are the keywords that we want to position ourselves on. When somebody is looking for podcast growth, podcast marketing, interviews about or on podcasting, we want them to find us. So those are the words that we put in the title. So we have a higher chance of the platforms showing our podcast to anybody looking for those specific keywords. Same for the description, right? And here I'm talking about the show description, not the show notes yet. The show description, so very simple, very straightforward with a call to action and being very straightforward about what this podcast is about. Weekly interview show where businesses and marketing leaders come to talk about their best practice in podcasting. Period. You can listen to all our episodes and read our articles on ghapodcast.com. Not going to talk too much about this, but this is basically because we want to drive as many people as possible towards our website. And then we have topic for the show includes B2B marketing, B2B podcasting, podcast, B2B lead gen, B2B lead generation, backlink, and so on and so forth. Because this is how you get people to find your podcast. So whatever your niche is, whatever the keyword that you've chosen to position yourself on based on your research, need to be figuring in your podcast titles, podcast description, and the show notes, obviously, especially if you have an episode talking about this. So there is a whole section where I break down how we do show notes at GHA Marketing. But here again, you want to have words for whatever your niche is all around the show description, specifically talking about what your episode is about and what people can expect to find from it, because this is how you're going to get them to find it. That's it. That's how you optimize for podcast platforms SEO. Now, YouTube. So YouTube is very specific because YouTube belongs to Google. So Google equals YouTube, YouTube equals Google. So here it's much harder to play with the algorithm, let's say. YouTube is not going to have it. So you just should know that thanks to your video, YouTube is going to understand what your episode is about and is going to propose it to the right people, at least the people looking for this specifically. Now, of course, you can try and optimize the titles, try and optimize the description, try and optimize the tags, but actually a quick word about this. So in the description, yes, for sure, you should make sure that there are specific keywords figuring in there, but the success of YouTube is mainly going to happen on the thumbnail and the title. And I'll get back to this a little bit later on. We're giving away everything. But you want to look at the description as well, make sure that the right words are in there. There is such a thing as YouTube tags, which can be identified as hashtags for Instagram back in the days. And here, YouTube specifically has said that this is not going to help the discoverability of your video. What's going to happen with tags is that if you have a misspelled word or something that is commonly misspelled when people are looking for something, this is where you want to have those misspells in the tags. This is the only reason you want to have specific optimization around the tags. Anybody saying you otherwise is literally saying something that YouTube is not doing, nor even saying. So SEO optimization for YouTube is very, very hard. It's basically going to be dependent on what's in the video, back to the importance of optimizing your content around the specific keywords. Never gonna stress that enough. But that's pretty much it on YouTube. Now, if you have a website, and I haven't added it here because that's something that we cover a little bit later on. If you have a website, of course, you want to optimize your articles for SEO. So if you transform your podcast episodes into articles, you want to optimize those articles for SEO. A quick word about transcripts, because I know a lot of podcasters are actually doing transcripts. This doesn't work. Simple as that. And if you're doubting this, just try and think of a time where and when you Googled something and Google gave you in the top results a transcript of a video or of a podcast. I suppose and I assume this never happened. This is because Google knows, and if there is anything we can trust Google when it comes to proposing the best results, Google knows that nobody reads transcripts, so they are not proposing it to anybody. So it was again good in 2000, basically, when we were at the beginning of SEO and when keyword stuffing was very good to rank, because then obviously the transcript is very rich in keywords, stuffed with keywords around your topic, and this is when a transcript was useful and efficient. Now it is not, and if anything, it might be hurting a bit your SEO because this might look like keyword stuffing. So if you're having a website and you're posting the podcast there, do not put the transcripts. At worst, the show notes, at best, an SEO optimized article. So that's for the organic discoverability. I want to quickly talk about paid. So when it comes to paid, so we've been playing and doing some paid for specific strategic podcasts. You have plenty of ways that you can advertise your podcast, right? Again, my number one recommendation is to have good content in the first place to see your podcast grow on itself if you want to advertise it, because this costs some money and you don't want to engage money in something that's not going to return on investment, obviously. So you want to have a compounding podcast in the first place that you know you have a good product, so that when you're going to send more people, you're only going to get more long-time listeners. If it's just to have a temporary boost in downloads, well, if you want to spend your money that way, that's of course your choice. That's not what's going to make a successful on the long-term podcast. So a quick word about each of the platforms that you can advertise on. So we find Google Ads, Meta, LinkedIn Ads, Pinterest, Spotify advertising is something as well. We can also advertise within other podcasts. So now, in order of preference, what we've seen being the most efficient is Google Ads, actually, because you can specifically target keywords that you think are relevant for your podcast. Now, obviously, you can play with Meta, you can play with LinkedIn Ads. This one has the worst ROI in our experience. Again, I'm sure some people make it work, but in our experience, LinkedIn Ads has the worst ROI. Pinterest is something that not a lot of people are doing and advertising on, but it is very efficient. And then you have advertising directly on Spotify. It's a new model. It's not yet very well developed. This doesn't guarantee results, but it works and it can get better in the future, 100%. But what we would recommend if you really want to do paid ad is to look at Google Ads. You can also look at advertising within other podcasts, right? So Spotify advertising would be how to get Spotify to like show your podcast specifically on the homepage or as a little ribbon at the top of the app. And within other podcasts is going to certain platforms and saying, hey, I want that in podcast, there is an ad talking about my podcast. So overall, Google Ads is the best way to go, in our opinion. If you advertise on other people's podcasts or on podcast platforms, this actually kind of makes sense as well, right? Because this is the type of audience that you want to tap into. It's people listening to podcasts. Now, the algorithm of those platforms are not yet as good, and probably will never be as good as Google, because Google Ads is literally how Google makes money, and they are getting very, very, very good at it. They are getting good at, they're already very good at getting the right people to see your ad and click on it. So return on investment, Google Ad is the best. If you want to toy with the idea of advertising on other podcasts, that's good, but then you need to make sure that the podcasts that it's going to be advertised on are relevant. And if it's competitors' podcast, that there is a whole question around, but do you want your competitors' audience to hear your stuff? Probably, but then are competitors even going to agree? That's another thing. And then the cost might not be worth, and so on and so forth. So I'm not a huge fan of paid ads, as you can see. If you are doing something, go for Google Ads, and you can toy with the idea and the concept of Spotify advertising and other podcasts, but at a certain level of risk. Now, how to advertise, obviously. So the best way to advertise is by far having good and relevant snippets from your episodes themselves. That's going to be what converts the best. This is how you get people to see that's the podcast. This is how you get people to get an idea of what's going to be in the episode. Like, this is the best. Now, if you don't have good snippets, like for instance, you don't have proper video enough, or you can't find something that will do well as an ad within your episodes, you can work on other things. You can work on trailers. This is something that we do, for instance. It's like a 1-minute clip with cliffhangers. It's very heavily edited in terms of video to like catch the attention and make people click. This is very good as well. Static image or the podcast artwork can work as well, will convert a bit less well, but still worthwhile if you don't have snippets or trailers. And then just specific keywords for Google Ads obviously will do the job. This is how you can advertise your podcast. Here again, multiple disclaimer: don't do it if you don't have an already organically growing podcast. And then the return on investment might not be what you expect. And if you do anything, I would recommend Google Ads. Now, we've talked about discoverability, right? So you have great content, you are in a niche, you are killing it at quality, you've nailed how to optimize your discoverability, so you're getting people to find your podcast. But how do you get them to click, which is actually the important thing, right? So how to get clicks. And here I want to start by quoting somebody that everybody knows by now, Mr. Beast, right? Jimmy. So he says, I think it's in one of his podcast interviews actually, you can have the best video in the world. If nobody clicks on it, nobody will watch it. And what I mean by that is, and to go a little step further, you can have the best content in the world if you don't know how to market it, if you don't know how to get people to click on it, you're not going to get views. And I'm not talking about ads yet. I'm just talking about titles, right? Artwork, thumbnails. And this is what we're going to cover in this specific section. So when it comes to the podcast platforms, first and foremost. So first of all, you should know that you can choose a specific artwork for each and every episode, right? Whatever the podcast hosting platform you're using right now, they give you the option of setting the specific artwork for the specific episode that will be displayed next to the title. And this is something that you should do. People, while scrolling, will be more triggered by faces, by human faces, than just the podcast artwork. And if it varies, if it's different, it will also draw more attention. What we've seen working the best is putting someone's face on it. Ideally, the guest, if you have guests, with a strong facial and emotional expression. That's very, very good. With the name of the show to make the brand recognizable. And that's it. Bear in mind that people are listening to podcasts on their phone, so it's already a small screen. The podcast artwork on this, the podcast episode artwork on this is displayed very small. So you don't want to put too many elements in there. Not too much text for sure. Just somebody's face, just some emotions, just something that people will be able to relate to. Now, when it comes to the title, you want to be clickbaity and ... And I'm going to get back to this ... in a while. But basically what you want to be doing is you want people to feel FOMO if they are not clicking on your episode. Here again, you have a few things that you can do in order to optimize for that. So starting the episode titles with how to, the secret of, 7 reasons why, 5 ways to, here is why you've been lied about, so and so. This is how you get people to like stop and be like, oh, shit, I need to know what's in this episode. And that's how you get people to click. Now, it is super important to be clickbaity, but also to deliver on that clickbait. Like, clickbait is wrongfully known for people just, saying the most absolute crazy thing in the title, but then having a totally random article or piece of content whatsoever. You must avoid that. If you do this, you're going to lose the trust of the audience. It's important and good to be clickbaity to get more people to click, but then you need to deliver on that promise, on that clickbait. So the episode should be about what the title says. And if you give away 7 reasons why you should start a podcast in 2025, you need to give actually 7 reasons. And actually, at the beginning of the episode, you should highlight the 7 reasons to show that people came for something and they're going to get it. That's super, super important. But again, more to this in a few minutes. And last but not least, on YouTube. So on YouTube, it's all about the thumbnail, and the thumbnail. I'm never going to stress this enough. The thumbnail is going to be what makes or break your podcast on YouTube. And when you look at the top performing podcasters on YouTube, they are killing it at putting the right thumbnail, and they are also testing and iterating all the time. So I want to take practical examples just to walk you through this one. So The Diary of a CEO is one of the most successful podcasts on YouTube. They've really killed it in a few months/years. They've been going from, I think they had 1 million 6 months ago, and then they're at 8 million 340,000 subscribers. It's completely crazy. They are doing some paid ads on Facebook, but still. And as you can see, the thumbnails are always following a very specific format. So what makes a good thumbnail when it comes to podcasts? And that's something that I want to mention because when people are on YouTube, they usually expect a video, obviously, to be displayed when they click on something. When they find a podcast, it's not your normal video format from YouTube, right? It's something a bit specific. It's something a bit niche. So what you want to be doing is making it clear that it's a podcast. So when people click, they actually stay as well, because there is nothing worse than somebody clicking and bouncing right away. Bouncing meaning going away and stopping the video. So that's super important, making it clear and obvious that it's a podcast. Now, Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett, is known and renowned, and we all know that he has one of the biggest podcasts out there. So you also expect to find a podcast when you see his face. But still, if you are doing videos for your podcast on YouTube, you must bear that in mind. And the second element that we see is there are always faces, right? Faces with very good lighting, very good quality, and ideally, strong facial expressions, right? Like skepticism, doubt, anger, like interrogative, like suspecting something almost afraid. Like emotions is what sell. Like emotions is what people react to, and that's the element that you want to have in your thumbnails. Then we have sometimes some graphic elements. So here we see that they are testing stuff, right? To see if that sticks, if that gets people. But the thing that we have every time is text. Not too much text though, 4 or 5 words maximum, sometimes a bit more. But again, I don't know what percentage it is, but it's very high. I don't remember which one it is. I don't want to say something that is not true, but like a lot of people consume the YouTube videos on their phone. What that means is that, again, the screen is very small. So if your thumbnails has lots and lots of elements in it, we won't be able to read whatsoever on the phone, and people are less likely to click. So you don't want to have too many elements. And this is what Stephen Bartlett and the team at Diary of a CEO have understood. It's like not putting too many words. And what's in the words actually? So white on a black background is what works the best, and some keywords highlighted in red, but still with the font in white. This is what's going to work very well. And the last element that is very important is negativity. Negativity sells and gets much more clicks than positivity, because people are much more, we are trained in the Stone Age, right, to react to negativity. If a bear sleeps under an apple tree full of apples, we're not going to notice the apples, we're going to notice the bear, because the bear has a much higher chance of killing us than the apple, like saving us whatsoever. What I'm trying to say is people react to negativity, and that's something you want to bear in mind if you want to drive more clicks. Do not buy a house. Birth control changes who you are. Stop using scented candles. Former Google CEO, they leaked our secret. Negativity, negativity, negativity. This is what is going to get click. And again, it's a bit clickbaity, but you want it to be true and you want to deliver on that clickbait. Just a quick other example of another very successful podcaster on YouTube, Chris Williamson from Modern Wisdom. Here we see a bit of a different type of thumbnails, but you also see that his videos are much less successful. He's getting hundreds of thousands of views, which is less than millions from Stephen Bartlett. But here again, we find the big text in there, a bit of negativity, the party is over, media collapse, the name of the guest here as well, sometimes some pictures in a red frame. That works pretty well as well. And this is another style that you can inspire yourself from, which works pretty well. So the title. Title is important. Title is the second thing that people will check out on YouTube after seeing the thumbnails, right? The title shouldn't say the same thing as the thumbnail. It's super, super important. You want the title to complement the thumbnail. You want people to watch the thumbnail, being triggered, then check what the video is about in the title, and then decide to click. This is how you're going to get people to click on your video. It must bring something new to the thumbnail. And again, bear in mind that negativity wins. And that covers it for our section on discoverability. But hey, this is a masterclass about how to grow and market your podcast in 2035. So we are far from done. I want to talk about episode structure for more retention and more engagement. So we know now the context of podcast and how the market has evolved. We know how to create good content, and you know how to create good content. You know, once you have good content, how to get it discovered and how to get people to click on it and how to get people to stay. And this is all happening in the episode structure. People have clicked play. Now what? So the first few things, jumping straight into it. The first thing that you want to be happening in the episode is validating the thumbnail /title/clickbait that you had in place. it's super important to deliver on this, because psychologically people are going to click on something because they expect to find something. The worst thing that can happen is they click expecting that something is going to happen in the episode and they don't have a clear validation that is going to happen. This is the worst that can happen. That's a lot of happen. So in the first 5 to 10 seconds maximum, you want to validate the title / the thumbnail. It's super, super important. So the best way to do this is to, whatever you've based the title on and the thumbnail on, is to take the 5-10 second snippet of this episode that talks about it and put it at the beginning. That's it. It's as simple as that. But this will increase your retention rate like crazy. Now, you can do this with a snippet. You can do this with a trailer. Something that works very well is saying something in the likes of, in this episode, you'll discover, and then what they are going to discover, right? You are still within that 5 seconds frame. And if you have a thumbnail saying, you've been lied to about, I don't know, proteins, and then you start the episode by saying, in this episode, we're going to talk about the type of protein that you can eat, the type of proteins that are harmful for you, the type of proteins that are good for you, and how to make a good meal prep for your week. Again, I'm going completely improv here, but you see the idea. It's super, super important to validate the clickbait in the first 5 to 10 seconds. We like to do, especially for the highly produced podcast, trailers that we put at the beginning of the episodes as well, because in there, you're going to be having validation of the thumbnail / title. You're also going to have cliffhangers, meaning sometimes we're going to be saying something like, hey, and the worst type of protein that you can eat is boom, we put a dramatic sound, and people understand and feel that they have to listen to the whole episode if they want to get the answer to what the worst protein to eat is. So trailer is really, really good for that. A snippet will do just well. In this episode, you'll discover, and then having a list of what to talk about this episode is also very, very good. Once you have that, you validated why people came and clicked for, so you can move on with the episode. So then you can have a good 1-minute intro plus call to action. So if you have sponsors, this is where you put them. If you want people to help you grow the show, such as, hey, click, share, follow, and so on, this is where you put it as well. More about this later in this video. But so after the validation of the thumbnail / title, you want to have the introduction with proper music transition and so on, obviously. Then you want to have the episode, and towards the end, you want to have an outro and a call to action. It's super important at the end of the episode to thank the people for having listened to the whole thing, but also have another bunch of call to actions like, hey, if you're still here, you probably took value from this episode. Please, may I ask you for a review, a reshare, share it with a friend. There is probably somebody that it will be useful for in your environment. Just can you send the episode to them? It might be helpful. Like a call to action at the end is going to get a very good click-to-action rate, because it's at the end, people have gotten all the value from you. And this is what they're like, yeah, okay, I need to do something with my phone anyways. They're going to put it out, boom, share, like, review, and so on. You can have some ads / sponsors / CTA breaks, so CTA call to action, during the episode. This is to be played with lightly, because you don't want to antagonize the episode. So we have clients who have like big sponsors, with whom the arrangement is also to give a shout out during the episode, right? Whilst people are engaged. And with a lesser likelihood to just moving forward and not listening to that specific segment. So this can be very good. This can be efficient as well, right? If you are giving tons of value within an episode, and all of a sudden you're saying, hey, if you like that, if you're listening to this right now, it's probably because you're interested in XYZ. You might want to go and check out my free ebook on my website, or my video on this, or whatsoever. So in the middle of the episode is a good time to have a shout out break if needed. What we like to do is see it in tiers, right? So if you have an episode of 60 minutes, it's good to have a call to action at minute 20 and then minute 40. This is how you're going to typically put in content. And that's pretty much it. That's what makes a good episode structure. This is how you get people to engage. This is how you get people to listen till the end. And this is how you make sure that people listening till the end are also helping you do something, because if they are still here at the end of the episode, it means that they enjoyed the episode. Unless they're a bot, obviously. Talking about episodes length. So something that we've heard and been asked a lot is, what is the best episode length? So here again, what we want to emphasize is how to optimize for completion. Completion is the number one metric that you should aim for, because completion means more people come back, more people recommend, and the algorithm see this. So the longer the episode, the less likely it is in absolute that people listen till the end, right? Anything can happen. You can stop the activity that you were doing and you have to talk to somebody and you finish your drive and whatever it is, right? So If your episodes are too long, you put the retention rate in jeopardy. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot do very long episodes, and we're going to see a little bit later on why, but that's something that you need to bear in mind. Now, if we look again at the Buzzsprout statistics, right, we also see that most of the podcasts are going to be between the 20 to 40 minutes mark, and some of them, a high percentage of them, are going to be between the 40 and 60 minutes mark. The 20 to 40 minutes mark is the one that's going to get the best retention rate from our experience, especially for tactical episodes, right? If you're not having a podcast about entertainment, if you're solving a problem, if you're helping people identify and solve a pain point, whatever it is, if you have a company behind the podcast, 20 to 40 minutes is ideal. If you have conversations, very insightful conversations with specific guests, don't hesitate to make it longer, right? Especially if there is a lot of value in there. But what we would recommend if we really need to recommend something is somewhere between the 20 to 40 minutes mark. Now, that being said, but the biggest podcasts out there are all over 60 minutes. And I only took the top 4 podcasts in the world, right? So you have plenty of podcasts out there. The top 4 podcasts in the world are actually much longer than what Buzzsprout say. So if we look at the number one for a while now, and probably it's still going to be the case for a long time, the Joe Rogan Experience, right? His average episode's duration is 2 hours and 38 minutes. And he's the most listened to podcaster by far. Like, you have charts about this each and every month. And there are months where Joe Rogan had gotten twice the amount of downloads than the second ranking podcast. Like, Joe Rogan is really killing it in the space. And his average episode duration is 2 hours and 38 minutes. So that shows that you shouldn't be doing short episodes because that's just what has the higher likelihood of making a podcast successful. You should be episodes that have, you got it, great content inside. But then you can also look at 20 to 40 minutes if you really need to make a choice. And same thing for our New Heights, right? Which is the second most listened to podcast, 1 hour 30 on average. Huberman Lab, 2 hours on average. And then he has snippet of this that he puts as 30, 40 minute snippet. Call Her Daddy, right? The 4th most listened to podcast, 1 hour minimum on her episodes with Alex Cooper. So yeah, lots and lots of proof that long episodes are good. Now, those people also fell into the entertainment space. Of course, Huberman wants to be educational, right? Same for Alex Cooper. Joe Rogan has guests that are just absolutely big-time guests, and he wants to take the time to interview them. But you must bear in mind that this is the top 0.1% of the podcast. And as we were saying at the beginning of this episode, those are the people reaping the most downloads. But it doesn't mean that you should follow the exact same model. That is pretty much it in terms of content discoverability, episode structure, retention rate, and so on. Now, let's get a bit tactical about the show notes game. So first of all, I want to mention that the show notes are for 2 types of people. The first type of people are the people who haven't listened to the episode yet and who want to find out what's in it. Same for the platforms. This helps the platforms a lot, understanding what's in the episode so they can propose it to the right people, back to the piece around the SEO from earlier in the video. The second type of people that are going to check show notes are the people who have listened to the episode and want to find out more. It is super important to keep those 2 avatars in mind when you're building and structuring show notes. Now, also bear in mind that I'd say 80, and this is completely arbitrary, 80-90% of people don't check the show notes. But for those who do, they are taking actions and you want to capture them. Like, this is your chance. So the way we structure show notes, it might vary a bit depending on your objectives with the podcast, but our objective with the podcast is to drive traffic towards our website because we have a business behind it. And so the first thing we do, which is something that will be appearing also at the top of the excerpt when people haven't clicked on the show notes yet, is a call to actions towards more value. Look into 3 ways to generate leads with your podcast ebook for free here on our website, and then we put the embedded links to our website. This is just a call to action which drive people there. If you have a sponsor, it might be good to have a call to action towards a sponsor. If you want to grow your Instagram profile, it's good to have a call to action towards Instagram profile. Whatever it is, we like to start the show notes with a call to action because that means anybody who wants to take further action after listening to the podcast knows exactly where they should go and what they will get out of it. Call to action at the top of the show notes, very underrated, super over delivery. And then we start with the traditional show notes. So welcome to Podcast Guru, and then introduction. So first of all, bear in mind that most people listen to podcasts on their phones, right? So the screen is already small. people came for an audio format, they are not going to read, right? They are not going to read a lot. And I still see podcasters having like blocks of text about what the episode and introduction of the guest and so on. People are not reading this. People are lazy. The attention span is like very short nowadays. So you don't want to have too much of a hard text to read. So what I recommend is paragraphs of 2-3 lines maximum. And I really mean maximum. Now, you want to start the show notes, with a first paragraph around the speakers, including yourself, right? Including the host. Why? You want people to understand who they are listening to, right? You want to understand why they are legit to talk about what they are talking about. And for the people discovering you for the first time, which is normally at each and every episode, if you have a self-growing podcast and also you're marketing it well, you have new people listening to you every time, right? So you must not assume that they know you. So quickly introduce yourself, right? Guillaume Jouvencel, podcast strategist and founder of GHA Marketing. That's it. That's enough. That says enough. Just introduce yourself and say who you are and why you're relevant to talk about what you're talking about. Then if you have a guest, on this episode I didn't, if you have a guest, have a quick excerpt around the guest as well. Just explain who the guest is so people can understand, okay, they are going to talk about, I don't know, like nuclear, and they are having an expert on nuclear to come on the episode. Again, completely coming in improv here. Then you want to have a bullet point list of what's in the episode. You want to make it clear, like, hey, in this episode, expect to learn, boom, bullet point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't want to have like 16 timestamps with different sections, which a lot of AI show notes generators come up with. Again, people are not going to read this. You need to be succinct. You need to be fast, and you are creating these show notes for people, right? So the bullet point is really just going to be for the algorithm to understand what's in the episode and for people to understand what's in the episode. If you put the timestamps, which we didn't for this episode, people can jump right to the section as well, which is a double-edged sword because that means there is not a 100% consumption rate. But if it's also the only way that you have to get the people to listen, the person to listen, that it might be worthwhile. And then you want to have links towards your website, your social medias, your guest resources, everything. So here, it's not the whole show notes. I don't know why I was lazy, but I did it. I didn't capture the rest of the show notes. But if you go on our podcast, you'll see that we have links towards everywhere. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok. Like, we want to make it easy for people to connect with us. And you should be doing the same. Because that's, again, for the second type of people, right? The people who have listened to the whole episode and want to find out more. You want people to be able to find you where they want, right? Because you might be super active on LinkedIn and you just post the link towards your LinkedIn. But what if that person is not on LinkedIn? What if they don't want to engage with you on LinkedIn and their favorite platform is Instagram? This is why it's super important to be at least a bit active on each of those platforms so people can connect with you and find out more about you on the platform that they want. This helps engagement like crazy. This helps building trust like crazy. And this means potentially people coming back to the episode or to your podcast later on in the future if they follow you, hit you up in DMs, whatever it is. So make it easy for people to connect with you, because if you make it easy for them to connect with you, they will. And that's pretty much it for the show notes. I want to talk about call to action, right? So that's something that we covered here in the episode structure, and it's basically what to ask your audience. So there are multiple things that you can ask your audience, right? So share, review, follow, go to my website, check out my Instagram. This episode is sponsored by, and so on and so forth. I'm also considering a call to action in the sense of you are not giving per se to the audience, but you're asking something, right? You're not giving them value. You are asking them to do something, to take action. So here again, in the call to actions, you can optimize for many different things. You can optimize for growth of the podcast, for growth of another platform. You can optimize for leads. You can optimize to direct people towards something specific, a landing page, a free form, an ebook, whatever. Get a high return on investment for your sponsors, right? Like literally giving a shout out to your sponsors and potentially saying, hey, go on this website and use discount code awesome podcaster to get a 10% discount. This is an ask, right? It's like, hey, buy their stuff. Now, this whole video is about, and this masterclass is about how to grow a podcast. So this is what we're going to focus the call to action on. But here, if you're interested in learning more about this other type of actions, just hit me up in the comments and I release a video about it. So there are a few things that you can ask for, right? In the call to action, you can say, hey, if you enjoyed the episode, please don't hesitate to follow wherever you're listening to this. You can also say, hey, if you enjoyed the episode and you think it might help somebody, don't hesitate to share it. This is how we grow, but this also might help a friend. For the people listening till the end, you want to have those call to actions again. So you can have a call to action saying, hey, by the way, by the end of the episode, I'll do this. Or if you listen till the end, you'll have that. And you can learn more about XYZ, whatever it is. That's a form of call to action. And you can also ask for reviews, which is going to be a good way to get social proof. So this is everything you can do to call for action and grow the podcast somehow, right? So a few words here on what to prioritize and what to go for. First of all, you should know that followers and high consumption rates are two metrics that both Apple Podcasts and Spotify look at to rank a podcast in the charts, right? So we have to bear in mind, like any other platform, the goal of a podcast platform is to keep and grow the number of users using that platform, right? If you help a platform make more people stay longer on the platform, this means more money for those platforms. This means that they will favor and advertise your content more. That's just logic. This is why Instagram is also and TikTok are rewarding creators for putting videos that are getting lots of views, because it means people are staying longer there. So that's the ABC of platforms, and you want to help those platforms do that, because if you help them get more users and more retained users, they will help you as well. By the way, the other metric to rank in the charts is actually getting more people to listen to your podcast. So getting more followers, getting people to listen till the end, and getting more people to listen to your podcast are three factors that help ranking in the charts. Now, this also means, because that can mean everything, right? So basically, there's only going to be the same 200 podcasts ranking in the charts because we saw the 200 biggest. Well, not really. And as Apple Podcasts specifies in the explanation of their charts, this is not in absolute over the lifetime of the platforms, right? It can be over a specific period of time. And what you want to be optimizing for is within a short period of time, getting many new listeners / many new followers / more people listening till the end. If you manage to put this within a short period of time, which is where the whole marketing aspect comes into play, this is how you're going to make the most use of the potential of ranking in the charts. But so here again, depends what the goal is. What I like to do is to ask for a review and a follow. 5-star reviews are not used to rank in the charts. I mean, it's not a metric that Apple Podcasts and Spotify look at to rank a podcast in the charts. However, this is social proof. And when you get somebody to discover your podcast, nothing is better than social proof. So if you get more reviews and more ratings, you will get more people to be like, oh, wait a second, this person must be legit because they have 100 reviews, just throwing something out there, which means that they have a higher likelihood of clicking on play. So when they find out about your podcast, they click on play, and then they can follow, then they can listen to the end. Now, I'm also saying, hey, and don't hesitate to follow or subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify. This literally just takes 5 seconds, and this means the world to me. Something like this, non-pushy, non-salesy, is very, very good. And then you can obviously optimize for whatever you want. People sharing your episode is also very, very good. The surprising and funny thing is, in our case, for instance, which is why we are never saying, hey, share the episode with a friend, is because we don't have a podcast that a lot of podcasters don't have podcasters friends, or at least from what we've seen and what we've understood. It's just like an entrepreneur or a business owner or somebody who's built a business around the podcast, but who doesn't know many podcasters to begin with. So that's why we are not optimizing for this. But depending on your niche, depending on what you know might work for your industry, you might want to adjust a bit this call to action. And that covers pretty well, in my opinion, how to grow podcasts. And we've also obviously touched upon some things around how to market it. Let's now talk about how to market a podcast, how to actually boost an organically growing podcast. So here again, there are a few things that I want to cover here. According to data, so according to the study that's from Podcast Marketing Academy, because here again, they've asked the 500 plus podcasters what were the factors of growth and what they consider helped the most. I also want to talk about the podcast as a content repurposing machine and what you can do with it. Our secret weapon that we have put in place for all the podcasts that we are working with, because this is just so good and this works so well to grow podcasts. And then I'm going to quickly touch upon whether you should have a website or not for your podcast. And if you do have a website for your podcast or for your company, where should the podcast be hosted? So let's look first at data and what works according to this study. So here, basically, they've asked people to rank from 0 to 10 the effectiveness of a specific tactic to get podcast growth. So as you see, there is more than 509 podcasters there with different growth and different episodes per downloads per episodes profiles. Number one is podcast app pitching. So I'm going to get back to this in a few minutes and we're going to go in details on each of those aspects. Obviously, this is the whole playbook. But so basically podcast app pitching is to say, so only Apple Podcast proposes that, is to say Apple Podcast, hey, can you put my show at the top of the homepage or at the top of my category for a specific episode, for instance. This is what, according to the respondent, is the most effective when it comes to growing and getting more downloads and followers. Guest co-marketing, so that's basically the guest resharing the episode and saying, hey, I've appeared on this podcast, go and share it and go and listen to it. Highly effective, obviously, and I get back to it a little bit later on with more extensive insights. Podcast guesting, so being a guest on other podcasts works really well as well, because obviously you're tapping into an existing audience that consumes podcasts. Collaboration and PR, I'm putting them a bit in the same bucket here, but it's just basically like doing everything you can to advertise the podcast within the podcast world and outside. YouTube, so here I really disagree on the effectiveness from what we've seen and from our experience at least, but it's true that there is rules on how to do YouTube seriously and properly, which will heavily impact whether that's growing your podcast or not. Social media, same comment here, but interesting that it comes third to last. Advertising and podcast growth services. So here we find back the two topics that are a bit sensitive in the industry. So I talked about paid ads already to grow your podcast. And for me, that's not a surprise that it's not ranking really well in terms of how much it helps and how effective it is to grow a podcast. And podcast growth services are basically paying to get downloads, right? And hoping that somehow you're going to get some of those to stay on your podcast. But here again, I'm going to break this down a bit more in depth. I just wanted you to have in mind the overview of what's considered as highly effective versus least effective when it comes to marketing a podcast, optimizing for growth. So let's look into each of them. So app pitching, as said, that's Apple Podcasts basically displaying your episode / podcast on the lobby screen. It's good. From our experience, it requires an existing / good podcast, right? Obviously, lots and lots and lots of people are inquiring to get their podcast displayed there. You must have a good reason. You must make your case. You basically apply via a form on Apple Podcast, and they choose whether or not they accept it. So if you have a very good and interesting theme, if it answers to certain criteria, and if you have a big time guest, for instance, you might be appearing there. It's very hard to get your episode to be featured there, but if it is, and if it gets featured there, then there is very, very good consequences to that. So we are helping a client at the moment do this. It takes a lot of effort. That's a lot of strategy. You also make sure that you respect the different platforms' agendas. So there are lots of things to take into account, but this can work very, very well. And again, it's great for exceptional interviews / episodes. If you have a big time guest in your niche that is renowned a bit outside your niche, which is already very rare, this can be very, very, very good. And the only thing that we've noted here is that when you're starting a podcast, it's going to be very, very tricky to get there. Guest co-marketing. So this is for us by far the best way to market a podcast, especially if you have guests that have a certain level of audience. Now, you have to know that not all the guests are resharing their podcast appearances, right? Especially the ones appearing on lots of podcasts, or the ones considering the content not worthy of being displayed on to their audience. So here we're a bit back to the producing great content point, right? This is really what you should optimize for. The episode must be good in the first place. You want to ideally make the guest appear well, but you don't want to do this at the expense of the trust that you've built with the audience. So it's always something to play with and to make sure that you're not antagonizing the audience. Doing trailers, so this clip that I talked about, right? So this 1 minute clip where you take 5 to 10 snippets of the episode with cliffhangers, with heavy video editing, with like boom and like noises and so on to really catch and retain attention. We've seen those trailers do extremely, extremely well, especially on LinkedIn, if you have a lot of potential audience there. But any other platform, we put this at the beginning of our YouTube videos as well. This does absolutely amazing. And this is a great piece of content. So I guess we'll usually be very happy to reshare this. And that applies for overall all the repurposing of the content, right? So if you do snippets, if you do articles, if you do trailers, if you do something that is shareable and that is of high quality, you have a much higher likelihood of the guest resharing it, which is what you want to optimize for. Now, you also want to make sure that you create specific assets for the platforms where the guest is the most present, right? You can do an amazing video trailer that's going to do amazing on LinkedIn, but if your guest is having the largest part of their audience on Twitter and they like to be on Twitter, the trailer is not going to do anything to stay corporately correct. So you want to make sure that you have assets that fit the platform, and back to the importance of like repurposing the content properly and also being active on most of the platforms. And last but certainly not least, and this is actually, if you don't do this, all of the rest, all of the above is not really applicable anyways, you need to inform the guests that the episode is live, right? So whether that's through tagging them on the platforms, but most importantly, sending them an email saying, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. Amazing episode, already great feedback. By the way, we've put this together, or you put the link towards the publication if you want them to reshare your publication. It'd be great if you can reshare it. I think that would be valuable to your audience. Here again, the higher the quality of that piece of content, the better the chances that they share. Guest co-marketing, best way to market a podcast. Podcast guesting. So going on other podcasts and talk about yours. So here, there are a few things to take into consideration. First of all, obviously, if you go on another podcast and you advertise yours, you're talking to the perfect audience, right? At least in the sense of the audience consuming other pieces of podcast content. Now, this requires, to get invited on the shows that will really make a difference, you need to have a certain brand/authority, which might be lacking when starting. If you're already renowned in an industry and you're just starting a podcast, then this might be applicable for you. This requires a bit double the efforts, right? Because you're recording your own episodes and then you're going to record episodes for other podcasts. But sometimes you can say like, hey, can I share the episode on my show 1 month later? This works really well. And so that's kind of a prerequisite. And there is a whole and certain process that needs to be put in place to do a proper reach out, proper follow-up, prepare properly, and so on and so forth. So you literally have whole businesses and agencies that have this as a foundation, like getting high authorities on people's podcast because they know that the impact will be positive and so on. But so you have professionals doing this. We are not doing it except for a handful of clients that we are doing much more with. But the whole point here is, this takes effort, organizations, and structure to list a proper list of podcasters, identify the ones that are really going to make the difference, reach out to them. Usually the successful podcast, the podcast that you want to appear on, have already lots of requests. So how to stand out, how to present yourself in a way that's going to increase the likelihood of you being featured on the podcast as a guest, and so on and so forth. So a whole bunch of stuff to take into account. But it can be a fantastic way to promote your podcast and to market it, and also to network, right? If you're going on other people's podcasts within your niche, unless they are competitors, there might be people very good to network with and to put into your contacts book. So podcast guesting, definitely something we recommend as well, and that we've seen lots of success from. Collabs and PR. So basically, what I understand is it's the work done outside of the podcast, really. And if you have an existing network, this can be very efficient. For me, the term is very broad. That's why I've also put it in together with PR, collabs and PR. Obviously, anything that you can do outside of the podcast to advertise the podcast is good. Is it where I would put the focus on? Probably not, because the double-edged sword to this is you advertise to a whole bunch of stuff you advertise a whole bunch of stuff to a whole bunch of people who are not listening to podcasts, so you're not getting your podcast to grow. But this might have other consequences as well, right? And I've been putting my foot in the door to many places back in my Corporate Treasury 101 days, one of our first shows. Thanks to the podcast, we ended up not recording an episode, but that was a very good way to get introduced to people. So collabs and PR, interesting, probably not the thing that you want to do if you want to grow the podcast. YouTube. So by the time this video goes live, there is already another one on my channel about YouTube and why podcasters cannot ignore YouTube anymore. We've also already covered it in this very video. So we are huge believers in YouTube. I'm a huge believer in YouTube. YouTube is the second most visited website in the world, the #1 podcast platform for US listeners. So we can imagine that this is also applicable to a lot of other places in the world. I'm not saying all, but a lot. YouTube, super important. Go for it. The social media game. So here, we've already talked about it in a way. So social media game, I'm talking about the 6 main social media platforms, right? So LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. All the platforms where you can do short form content or where you have a very large user base. This is where you want to talk about the podcast when it comes to social media. So obviously trailers, This is a very specific piece of content. Not all podcasters can afford to do this, let alone not only in terms of resources, but time as well, right? And this also takes a certain set of skills, but trailers can do very, 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 very well, especially on LinkedIn and YouTube at the beginning of your video. Now, short form content. So obviously short form content, super important. Here again, we've heard so many times podcasters saying, hey, yes, I started doing social media, but it didn't do anything for me. So first of all, you need to have a great podcast that compounds on itself. Never gonna stress this enough. The second thing you need to be doing is not just put out short form content for the sake of putting out short form content. And what I mean by that is, especially nowadays, you have lots and lots of platforms like Opus Pro, like Riverside, and many, many other platforms that take a long form video and produce automatically like 20 pieces of short form content. This is amazing in terms of time gain, right? This is absolutely fantastic. If your objective is just to, put some content out there without really an objective behind it, that's perfect. And at least you're getting a bit present on those platforms. Now, if the objective is to get views, if the objective is to get engagements, if the objective is to grow the podcast, you cannot just say, oh yeah, but I'm using this AI tool producing short form content and I'm not getting any results. Well, it's probably because you're not doing this right. And I'm saying this, as you see, I love this whole thing. So that's why I'm so engaged with it. It's like you have a bunch of tools nowadays that are absolutely fantastic, but that are a bit deceiving people on what the actual outcome of using that product are going to be. Because yes, you can put tons of short form content, like you can put 20 short clips per episode if you want. But if that does very little to your podcast, let alone anything for your business, then that's not really valuable. So how to actually do great short form content? Here again, it's all going to be about the content that you select, which must be from a piece of amazing content. The content that you select needs to be tailored for social media platforms. So ideally, it's less than 30 seconds. It is a bit controversial, or it is a strong stance, or it is something that people will be able to react to. Then, the same way the thumbnail is absolutely critical for a successful YouTube video, the hook of a short form content, the first 3 seconds, is the most important thing that you can work on a short form content. If you don't have the right hook, people will just scroll through and not watch your stuff. So the hook must be nailed. This is where AI tool starts to fall short, even if that means taking a snippet from another part of the episode and putting it at the beginning of your snippet, or taking a snippet of 3 seconds at second 20 of your snippet and also put it at the beginning. Even if it means recording separate hooks separately of your episode and then sticking them to your short form content, because this is what it actually takes. This is what it means to get good short form content out there that will benefit your podcast. Then, of course, you want the short form content to be of value add for your ideal audience. You want to have some level of good editing, especially audio and video. Basically, you want to retain people's attention in the sense of the content, but also visually, and this is where editing comes into play. And something that we like to do is the 2 seconds frame rule. So if you have a frame that lasts more than 2 seconds, this is not going to be a good performing short form content. Of course, you're going to have exceptions, but as said, the attention span of people is very low. And when going on short form content platforms, people expect things to go fast. This is why they are so keen to scroll. So you want to have something happening on your video every 2 seconds. Now, you also want to have captions done properly, right? So insightful written post and captions. So does it really matter? Yes, it absolutely matters. And you don't want to use the same caption for all 6 platforms. Each platforms have their specific user base. Now, you can be active on LinkedIn for certain for certain things, and on Instagram for other things. So although you're the same person, the things that you expect to see on LinkedIn and on Instagram are very different, right? And you should tailor the captions according to this. So here, there is a whole masterclass to this, but it's basically on LinkedIn, you like to have a good, very well written post, for instance. On Instagram, it's going to matter less, but you want to put things such as, hey, check the link in bio, or comment this, or DM me that, and I'll send you something. On TikTok, you want to have certain level of optimization as well. On Facebook, you can embed links in the caption. So if you want people to take action, this is how you do. And on YouTube, you want to link that short form content to the long form content so people can find out more if they want. So there is a degree of customization in each of the platforms that you must not overlook. Again, if you want this to be successful. So in terms of number of short form content / post per episode, we like to do 3 to 4 posts per episode for each of the 6 platforms. So even on the lower end, that means that on average, we publish 18 pieces of content on social medias for each and every episode. So if you have a weekly podcast, I let you do the math because I'm absolutely terrible at it. 72 pieces of content on social media per month, thanks to your podcast. But it needs to be done right. And that covers pretty much the social media game. Now, advertising, we've already covered it in this video. Here again, that's something that you must take with a pinch of salt, but can be very efficient if you do the targeting well, if you have the proper keywords, and if you have the right audience on the right platform where you're advertising. And last but certainly not least, podcast growth services. So paying for downloads, basically. So this video is about a complete podcast growth and marketing strategy for 2025. So I must talk about the things that we've seen not and never working. And we've had lots of people coming to us with like absolutely outrageous numbers of downloads that they were just paying for. And the moment they stop, those numbers drop. And when you actually look at what's happening on the platforms, you indeed see a lot of downloads, but you also see people not always listening till the end. So a lot of those will be bots or like sketchy algorithms. Basically, this is not something we recommend. It's a very short-term play, which will eventually allow you to showcase big numbers. But any sponsor who might consider sponsoring your show will take this seriously and will try to understand what's behind it. And in any case, what you want to grow a podcast is long-term growth, long-term success. You want people, right, engaging with you and consuming your stuff and potentially bringing more value to your community. This is not the way to go, and this might even hurt if the bots are not listening to the episode entirely, and this hurts your consumption rate, and you're actually doing yourself a disfavor here. Podcast growth services, definitely do not recommend it. Some people have judged it efficient in terms of growth. The interesting thing to see is that nobody having a more than 100% growth is saying that this is beneficial. It's only the people who had a decreasing growth or the people between 21 and 100% growth. So here a bit of outliers. But yeah, I would take all these very carefully, podcast growth services, if you're considering doing it. This is not the way to go. Those are not real people most of the time. And on the long run, this is not going to help. Enough about my rants. So what works according to data? Now, I want to talk about podcasts as a content repurposing machine. So this is the assumption that we've based all our agency at the beginning on. It's like, but actually, if you have a podcast, not only do you get to network with people, but you get a whole content strategy for each and every platform that you're on. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, there are some nuances to that obviously we learned along the way, other things to take into account. But in essence, a podcast, if you take all this into account and if you implement properly the content, the structure, and so on, which are the pieces that we were missing at the start, content being the most important part of it. But once you have all this, and once you have the proper team to do proper content repurposing, or if you've learned to do it properly yourself, think about how many pieces of content can come out of an episode. And if you can't think about it, that's a good thing, because I'm just going to walk you through it right now. So in our world, each and every podcaster that we work with, right? Because this is almost a non-negotiable for us because of how efficient it can be. So one episode equals one audio episode, right? So on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and of course all the other podcast platforms, one video for YouTube and Spotify eventually, one article on your website. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, but like this can be an amazing piece of written content. 3 social media clips posted on 6 different platforms, meaning 18 pieces of content, and 1 trailer. Not all of our clients have trailers, but the first 4, they all do. Now, if you think about all this, and actually if you don't take into account the trailer, that is 21 pieces of content per week. So each and every week that you can release thanks to your podcast. It's like, I cannot stress enough how good and how efficient of a content strategy you can make thanks to a podcast executed well. Because again, if you don't have great content in the beginning and to begin with, the repurposed content is not going to be good neither. If you don't have video and audio quality to begin with, then the short form content is not going to be good, and people are going to hear that something is off in the audio. If you do not have the right guests, resharing at the right moment, this is not going to be efficient. But once you have all those elements, this is how you market a podcast. Like, this is how you get a holistic approach for your podcast. And actually, the incidence of this is also going to be, you're going to grow an audience on those platforms, not only on the podcast, but some people that are going to watch your short form content are going to be like, wait a second, I want more short form content from this podcaster. They're going to follow, they're going to subscribe, they're going to seek your content, they're going to consume more of it. So you're going to, thanks to the podcast, grow audiences on other platforms. This is just so good. And then if you have the right systems in place, if you have the right processes in place, the right links at the right places, you can send this traffic towards the podcast for more downloads, your website for more traffic if you're a business, a landing page if you have a sponsor or whatsoever. Repurposing your podcast content is an absolute banger. It's not too hard nowadays, thanks to a lot of tools, but to do it right, it takes a few things to do this properly. That's the content repurposing machine. That's something I wanted to talk about. Now, I also want to talk about our secret weapon. So, secret weapon, I've put Caitlin and her rifle. I don't know if you watched Arcane recently, amazing series on Netflix, but it's our point being our secret weapon, an email list. So, what do I mean by that? Whatever the objective of the podcast is, if it's to grow the podcast solely, if it's to get sponsors, bring on sponsors and partners on the show, if it's to grow your business thanks to a podcast, whatever you're going to do with your podcast, you want to have an email list. Because an email list is people that you can send news to. Those are people that you can inform of new episodes being live. And if they've opted in the first place, and if you're doing this right, you're going to get people that are going to listen to you each and every episode, guaranteed, thanks to your email list. Email list is just so good. And then if you have sponsors, you can put this in the mix of the package deal saying, hey, I actually have, 2,000 people receiving my emails weekly, and I have that much of opening rate, that much of click-through rate. So that means that you will get in front of that many people. If you want to generate leads with it, this is how you start nurturing leads, thanks to their email address. This is just gold, an email list. So how to do that? The first thing that you would require is a website / a landing page. Basically, what you want to be doing is having a form that captures email addresses. Now, one might ask, but why would I give you my email address, right? So in order to get people's email address, what you want to be doing is, at least the way we do it, is you want to lead with value. You want to propose something to the audience on top of the podcast for free in exchange of their email address. And this thing must be, in an ideal scenario, of as high value as possible and hitting on the very specific pain point that they started listening to you for. So if you have a business behind it, the thing you can do is give the first step to solving the most important problem your clients face, or give a case study or access to specific resources. It can be an ebook, it can be an exclusive video series, an exclusive podcast series, it can be a quiz, a test, whatever it is. It needs to be of value, it needs to be intriguing, and it needs to be catering to the topic that they are listening to you for in the first place. Practical examples. So we call this a lead magnet, obviously, offering something in exchange of an email address. For GHA Marketing, the way we do this is we give a free ebook that is about 3 ways to generate leads with your podcast. Anybody downloading this piece of ebook, this piece of content, is somebody I want to talk to, because they are literally trying to generate leads with their podcast. And this is a, I think, 60 pages ebook, 50 or 60 pages ebook. It's like we've put like days in writing this ebook. We're very proud of it, and we give away the whole playbook on how to generate leads with a podcast. And this is very efficient. Same thing for our other website, the first podcast we started with which we capture like about 160 email addresses per month. The corporate treasury ebook. And here again, simple thing, people are listening to us because they want to listen about corporate treasury, which is the niche podcast that we went for in the first place. And we are offering an ebook about exactly this. And guess what? People are downloading it. Actually, for most of the websites we implement this for, we convert between 5 and 10% of the website traffic, plus all the people that come from the podcast directly, right? Because as you've seen in our show notes, we have a call to action towards our ebook. So this is just tons and tons of people who are getting exposed to your lead magnet, potentially downloading your lead magnet, and then you capture the lead's email address. What to do then? Well, then you can email them each and every time you have a new episode. Here again, it needs to be valuable, right? It must not be just, hey, new episode is live, click here. It must be a well-summarized email about the episode, the value that they're going to get from it, and highlighting the benefits of listening to the episode. And then you can get to put the link and eventually get people to click on it. Our own metrics are, on average, for each and every people we implement this for, 45% open rate and 5% click-through rate. So if you're not within the email marketing world, you might not understand very well those metrics, but it doesn't matter too much. The point is 45% open rate is very, very big. 5% click-through rate is slightly above average. And this makes sense, right? Because this all comes from a value-led content strategy that is focused on providing more value to people. And then once they download your ebook, because bear in mind that if you want people to open and click in your emails, you must be providing amazing value in the first place. Back to the importance of having a great lead magnet and the importance of, you got it, having great content in the first place. But if you do all this, if you tick all those boxes, then you're going to get a very highly engaged audience that's going to open your email, click on your email. If you have an email list of like 10,000 people at some point, and if you have a 5% click-through rate, this is a guarantee that you're going to get 500 downloads per episode. Minimum, which is already, remember, which is already more than the top 10% of podcasts if we take the Buzzsprout statistic from here, right? So the top 10% podcasts, are getting 1,000 downloads plus, but top 10% podcast. This is a guarantee. You can have a guaranteed top 10% podcast if you email capture properly and if you nurture your leads and sending them the episodes. Like this is, as I said, this is our secret weapon. We are using it for podcast downloads, but we are also using it for lead gen, right? So we are nurturing leads thanks to this, and then we are getting them to engage with us, book a call with us, and potentially convert them into clients. Whatever the objective is, email list is absolutely fantastic. This requires a bit of setup, right? We are beyond just the podcast. It's like having a website / landing page, making sure that you can get people to a certain place, putting together the form, the lead magnet even, and then having the right softwares and systems to email people for each and every episode. This is a bit of heavy lifting. There is a bit of work here, but this is killing it. Like this is really, really, really the way to nurture your audience, nurture your leads, and get business if that's something that you want to do with your podcast. And last, but certainly not least, a website or no website. So I'm putting this after the lead gen / email list part because for the email list, you really can have just a landing page, right? You don't have to set up a whole website to have a lead magnet that people can download thanks to their email address. But there is also a question to be asked around, do you want to have a website around your podcast? So here are a few things that you need to take into account. If you want to build a brand around your podcast, if you want to be able to drive traffic towards a specific space, especially if you have a company and you're building a podcast to support your company, if you want to have an audience to engage with you, and if you want to generate leads, then a website is the way to go. In our opinion, whatever the objective of the podcast is, you should have a website because this is where you can capture email addresses. This is also where you can have an About Us section, give a bit more information about yourself. Even if you don't at the beginning, at some point you will have ways people can support the show with, such as merch or sponsors or affiliates or even your own product, whatever it is. A website is never a waste. And then if the podcast becomes big, the brand becomes big, the website becomes more and more valuable. And this is, again, somewhere that people can go to find out more about you and consume more of your stuff. So I would recommend every podcaster to have a website. Now, the question to be asked is, do you have a website dedicated to your podcast, or do you plug in the podcast to an existing website? So here, there are two scenarios. And we are literally doing one and the other depending on the podcast that we are looking at. For Corporate Treasure 101, which is our first website, we have built a website dedicated to our podcast. It literally has the same name. It's all about the podcast. We just have like a new Start Here section. We have articles that we write for each and every podcast, and that's something I wanted to touch upon. If you have a website, then you have the occasion and the opportunity to tap into the reading audience. What do I even mean with that? Bear in mind that we have about, and if we go back to the statistics at the beginning of this video, we have about 500 million listeners in the podcast industry, right? Which is a lot. But 77% of internet users, and I don't have the exact number here, but it's much bigger, 77% of internet users do read a blog post at least a month. Meaning the reading audience is actually much, much, much bigger than the podcast audience. Now, there is also much more content creators in there, so it's harder to differentiate and so on. But if you can kill two birds with one stone, that's something that you might want to consider. What we do for each and every episode that we release is we write an SEO optimized article for it. SEO optimized article, because again, transcripts is not a good way to post written content on your website, but an SEO optimized article is, especially if you have tactical episodes, right? Especially if you have episodes around a theme and it's not just entertainment, but it's like it's going to tackle a specific topic, then it's keyword rich. If you've done your research properly for the content, it's also something that people are looking for on Google. So you will literally get higher chances of ranking high for Google. And this is more people finding out about your stuff, finding out about your content. If you're capturing email addresses, that's more people giving you their email address and so on and so forth. So SEO optimized article is the way to go if you really want to take the podcast to the next level. And if you have a website, which we obviously recommend. Now, the pros of having a website dedicated for your podcast is that it's going to be a brand on its own, right? So some people do that if you want to sell the podcast at some point. That's an asset that you can sell with. But all in all, this is something that people can go to find out more about you, the story of the podcast, something that is harder to reflect on the podcast platforms. It's always easier to reflect on your website because you own it, right? You literally design it. You can have a partners page like we do for our show. You can have an about us section. You have a contact form, right? Which is something platforms, when it comes to podcasts, lack a bit. So it's like, hey, you want to be a guest or you want to ask a question, like just go to the contact section. So much can be achieved thanks to a podcast website. And this is why we decided to go for one for Corporate Treasury 101. Now, in which cases do you want to plug the podcast into an existing website? So here the answer is rather obvious. This is what we do for GHA Marketing and our podcast called Podcast Gurus. Here, there are some huge benefits SEO-wise and in terms of content for people to consume your content on a specific website. Because on our website, what we do have is a lead gen form. We have an opt-in form with an ebook on 3 ways to generate leads. So our interest, and if you're a business owner watching this, still watching this, congratulations if you made it till here. If you're a business owner watching this and you're like, having a website, in my opinion, your website is where the magic happens. This is the most important place on the internet for you. This is where people can consume more of your content, engage with you, build trust with you, find out more about you, find out more about your services, potentially become a lead, right? If you have the proper systems in place, or even a client directly, if you have offers that you can sell directly on your website. The website is the place to go, the place to be. And if you have a podcast and you do proper SEO optimized article and you have a page for each and every episode and you have the YouTube player and then the Spotify player on that page so people can watch and or listen to your podcast on your website, and it still counts as a view for those platforms, big brain time, you are making the magic happen. You are driving more traffic towards your website, you are helping it SEO-wise, and you're capturing more leads. Like this is the go-to. So if you have a business, what we heavily recommend is to have the podcast within a section on your website. So it's not displayed on the main menu for us because we don't want this to be the priority for people finding out about us. It is on the footer though, on the menu at the bottom of the page. But it is a very good way to drive new traffic to the website thanks to the SEO optimized articles and to get them to transform into leads, find out more about us and so on and so forth. So business owners, coaches, consultants, anybody that has something to sell, I would recommend you to have a podcast section on your main website. And that closes our masterclass growth and marketing strategy for podcasts for 2025. This was a hell of a video. It's probably going to be around 2 hours long. So if you're still here, congratulations. Thanks a lot for watching till the end. I hope you got value from this. I'm literally showing you everything we do for our clients and ourselves. There is literally not much more to it. So if you want to take this all and implement yourself, feel free and you're going to get a very successful podcast. Obviously, the difficulty is not only in the strategy and the knowledge, it's also in the execution, right? It's doing this consistently month after month. And right now you might be thinking, wait a minute, this actually sounds like a lot to make a podcast successful in 2025. And it is, right? Again, most of it's going to come down to the content, but bear in mind that you have many people trying to compete for your ideal audience's attention at the very moment. In theory, you're not just competing with other podcasts, but with any other entertainment or any other media when it comes to your specific niche. So you need to take podcast seriously if you want to make it successful. Consistency is key. And obviously you can do all these to as well make sure that your podcast is successful. So if you find this useful, if you think that this is actually the way to go into 2025 for your podcast, but you think that this is a lot to work on by yourself, here is my call to action. So if you want to help for your podcast or to start a podcast and you have a 4 to 5 digits offer, this is where we're really going to be able to help because we want you to get a return on investment on all this. You can reach out to me on Instagram and we can have a chat. So I've created the Instagram channel just for this. Guillaume Jouvencel, here's helping coaches and consultants grow and sell with podcasts, authority building and lead gen. Just hit me up and we can see how we can help you with your podcast. In any case, again, thank you so much for sticking to the end of the video. Really value that. If you enjoyed it, hope you found it valuable. If you have any feedback, if you would like me to make another video about anything else, please let me know. Cheers.